This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Don't shoot! Don't shoot!
Outrage over police killings of black people has fueled unrest from coast to coast.
And an extraordinary scene in the nation's capital.
No justice, no peace, no justice!
Some police cruisers drove into crowds.
As a black man, every day I wake up and wonder, will I be able to go home?
I can't breathe! I can't breathe! I can't breathe! I can't breathe!
Race Matters, America in Crisis, a PBS NewsHour special.
Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff. Welcome to this PBS NewsHour special, Race Matters, America in Crisis. The death of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minnesota has ignited outrage across the world and once again exposed the deep wounds of racism here in the U.S. Protesters have filled the streets in cities large and small, demanding justice and change. The vast majority have been peaceful, but there has been violence and looting, and there have been aggressive tactics from law enforcement. How Americans see all this is filtered in part through the lens of race, according to our new poll, one we do with NPR and Marist. 62% of Americans say they believe the demonstrations are legitimate protests. 77% of black Americans feel that way, but among white Americans, it's 58%. 28% of all Americans say they believe the demonstrations are people acting unlawfully. We want to examine how we got to this moment and where we go from here. That is a long conversation, and we think it's important to start by listening to black Americans. In days to come, all of us will decide what, if anything, will change. Tonight, we will ask questions about policing, inequality, and what it means to simply live while black in the U.S. But we begin with two influential voices who've thought long and hard about black history and America's future. Filmmaker and producer Ava DuVernay's work has focused on the black experience, including the film Selma, the documentary 13th, and the series When They See Us. Her media company, Array, has a new online educational platform about these issues. Darren Walker is the president of the Ford Foundation, which works to reduce poverty, improve equality, and social justice. For the record, the foundation is a funder of the NewsHour. Darren Walker, let me start with you. Why do you think what happened to George Floyd and the reaction to it has the hold on us that it seems to have, these massive protests that go on day after day across this country?
Judy, I think the moment of reckoning for this country on race has come. George Floyd has captured our hearts, our broken hearts, because for African Americans, his murder was but an extension and a long list of names over many, many years. So we actually, as a community, were not surprised. I think for white America was deeply wounded and shocked by the visual of his murder over 8.5 minutes. And I think for white America, deniability of racism in our policing and in our nation is no longer an option. And that is why it has gripped us and resonates so deeply in the American psyche.
Ava DuVernay, is it something that is simply a repeat of what we've seen over and over again, or is there something different about what happened to him this moment?
Well, certainly the act of Black Death is not new. I think though that there was something about the tape itself that was unusual as someone who unfortunately watches this material a lot for my work. And that was the very clear framing of both people looking directly to the camera. In other instances of murder by police on tape, we may see the victim through a body cam, which obscures the officer wearing the camera. We may see it from a distance on a security camera. It's very rare that we've seen both parties in the frame looking directly toward the lens. For me, that's what was startling. I really had to interrogate for myself, why is this bringing me to my knees, especially when I'm so used to watching this stuff. And I came to the conclusion that I could see that white officer's face. I could see his disdain. I could see his intention, in my view. I could see the callous disregard for human life.
And Darren Walker, there's a gut level demand for justice right now. What would justice look like?
We need to reform the systems that produce too much injustice, starting with our economic system. We have to look at fundamental questions in our economy, like the basic question of how much capital do we allocate for workers, so that we don't have an economy that produces too much prosperity for people like me and too little prosperity for people like George Floyd. We have to look at our criminal justice system and ask, why is it we lock up so many Black and brown men and women in this country? We have to look at our educational system and ask, why is it that we have school districts side by side, one affluent with a rich tax base and great schools, next door, a poor district without school books? This is America. The question is, will we go back to the playbook that we always do, which is to have leaders make statements, to have corporations issue platitudes, make some contributions to Black organizations, and then go back to business as usual? That playbook will not work on this occasion.
Well, when it comes to the playbook for the future, at first, it seems to me people need to talk about and need to have come to some kind of an agreement, Ava DuVernay, on who's at fault here. We know the policemen are involved. Is it generations of white Americans? Is it the police across the country? Is it politicians? Who is at fault?
All of the problems that we're seeing now, their foundations lie in our racist history as a country that's never been reconciled. The question now is, do people who believe in justice and dignity of all colors and kinds, can we digest that and start to let it nourish us as we really try to dismantle these systems? We'll have to get out of the framework, the way of thinking that any of this is salvageable, because it's truly not. It's built on a rotten foundation.
I would just say, Judy, to this point, we have to also acknowledge that what has happened in this country in the last 2 decades is a context of growing inequality in America. And we have had many white people who feel left behind. Inequality is so pernicious in a democracy because inequality asphyxiates hope, and hope is the oxygen of democracy. And so we have too many hopeless people, Black and white, but African Americans have a historic reckoning that this country has never come to terms with. We have a generation of downwardly mobile white people in this country. So we have today a confluence of two realities: the reality of Black grievance, which is right, and the reality of growing white economic vulnerability. That is what we are seeing on our street.
Given that, Ava DuVernay, How do you begin to make a difference?
It's really about inviting people, particularly Caucasian people, to put their heads together and think about strategies and tactics that only white people can really do. Imagine white folk got together who were well-meaning people who believed in justice and dignity for all, got together with strategies along those lines, very muscular, very demonstrative, beyond statements, beyond social media hashtags, but thought of strategies to actually work to dismantle these things actively. I think it would be a game changer.
Darren Walker, civil rights movement, there was Dr. Martin Luther King and other leaders from the white community, from the black community, leading the way. Who are the leaders of today?
There are courageous leaders willing to raise their hands, to roll up their sleeves. We have to be the leaders we need. We need our corporate leaders to throw out their playbook and start afresh, to get over, put a nail in the coffin of the Milton Friedman ideology that corporations' only purpose is to make money for shareholders. We have to have our policymakers and our political system respond to the people who are in the streets. I am inspired by these protesters, the peaceful protesters who simply want to live in a fair society. That is not too much to ask, and the time has come for America to save itself, to save our democracy.
Ava DuVernay, what would you say about this question of who do we look to for leadership? And the other question I have for you is, what do you say to the young African-American boy or girl who's sitting there right now, maybe with a white friend, both of them fearful about the future?
We've learned from our American history that Black leadership with one leader kind of put on a pedestal is dangerous. Every Black leader that has arisen through, the American media apparatus has been killed or exiled. That a distributed leadership model is the most healthy and most productive, in that there is no one place to pinpoint the scorn of the system. I would tell young people that these are not our darkest days, that our darkest days are when voices were being suppressed, where Black people were not allowed to write or read by the white power structure, where we were not able to walk into municipal buildings, having to go through the back. There have been gains made. We have to use those as tools in this new era and keep developing our systems and our strategies to defend ourselves. And so that's what I would invite the next generation to start thinking about now. I have a lot of white people calling me and texting me, great friends of mine, people that I love dearly, asking me, what do I do? And my answer is educate yourself. There have been, white allies throughout the history of America who have gotten together and come up with muscular strategies for change. And many of them have worked. And so I feel like there's kind of this question, what do I do? What do I do? Which really, is asking for Black labor in this moment to help you think through what to do. And trust me, there's something to do right where you are.
And that brings us to the last question I had, Darren Walker, which is, how do you give people hope? What is the message of hope that you have right now for everyone watching?
I am very hopeful, Judy. There are so many reasons for hope. First, because we live in a democracy, and every American needs to vote, and that we can see on the streets across this country reasons for hope. Young, Black, and brown, and queer, and people in wheelchairs, people old and young in the streets. They are in the streets because they too love America. They want America to be America.
I believe that we can do better, and that's where hope lies. I believe that this might be a tipping point. It's hard to say, but I'm hopeful that it is. And I'll be working to to engage with that hope actively. And that's what I invite others to do alongside us.
Ava DuVernay, Darren Walker, we thank you both so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
We turn now to the issue of policing and start by hearing from someone who knows firsthand about law enforcement and its intersection with Black Americans. 4 years ago, Terrence Crutcher was shot and killed by a police officer in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Yamiche Alcindor recently spoke with his sister, Tiffany, and a warning: some of the images will be difficult to watch.
My name is Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, twin sister of Terrence Crutcher, who was killed in Tulsa, Oklahoma in September of 2016 by a white female police officer by the name of Betty Jo Shelby. Terrence, they called him Big Crutch. He was a gentle giant. He was just a beautiful, beautiful soul. He was leaving to go to a church service with my mom and dad, and 15 minutes later, he was dead. And so his vehicle stalled in the middle of the road. From the testimony of Betty Shelby, she said she thought he was high and that he may have been having a mental health breakdown, and she wanted to help him. And then saw Terrence not communicating, not looking well, and she called for backup. Next thing we know, if you look at the video, there's police officers fleeing in, there's helicopters looming.
I think he may have just been tasered.
Shots fired!
And then the video just stops and Terrence is gone. And we found out that he was tased and shot simultaneously. And I know he was unarmed, and I know he didn't see the bullet coming. And the next thing that I remember and that I see every night when I lay down is his body on the ground with blood everywhere.
What was your reaction to watching the death of George Floyd on video?
George on video, I felt like Terrence was shot all over again. This time it was different. You know, hearing George cry out for his mom and watching the officer not even care or move, I elicited a stress reaction physically, and I couldn't sleep for at least 3 days, and I broke out in hives from the stress, and it's just been, I would say, traumatizing.
What don't people understand about families whose loved ones are killed on video? What's not shown about your experience?
What's not shown is that it's impacting us in a severe way from a mental health standpoint. For example, I got pulled over after Terrence was killed, and I took his little boy, Terrence Jr., and some of his cousins to the movies. And when the police turned on the lights and just sped up behind us, we pulled over, but the kids were screaming hysterically, saying that we're going to be shot, we're going to be killed. And I had to calm them down. And Terrence's kids are still in counseling. You know, they go twice a month. And right now, his daughters are saying, I wish that people would have protested for my dad like they're doing for George or like they're doing for Ahmaud. And they're dealing with this situation every single day, every time this happens on national TV.
We've seen that same exhaustion, anger, and frustration in the thousands and thousands of protesters out across the country. For many, George Floyd's death was just the latest example of decades of mistreatment by law enforcement. Beyond the individual cases like Floyd's and Terrence Crutcher's and Rodney King before them, statistics show African Americans bear a disproportionate toll at the hands of police. A 2019 study found that Black men and boys are almost 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police than white men and boys. But the disparities manifest in ways beyond fatal encounters. And as we will hear, the effect on many Black Americans from all walks of life runs deep. Yamiche Alcindor will have a conversation on all this, but first we hear more voices of those affected.
You have a daily fear of your life for no reason. I want to be able to go outside and do whatever the hell I want to do without worrying about someone trying to call the cops on me because I'm standing in front of their store, or someone trying to call the cops on me because I'm walking across the street, or I want to walk in their store with a hoodie on. That's how I want to walk. It's normal.
For it to be 2020 and not 1960, and it's still happening, this is heartbreaking, and nothing's being done.
It's happening so much that I expect that a black man's life each month is going to get taken by the police.
I've been stopped by the police when I had a white girlfriend, and he asked how we knew each other, and I told him, and he said, I guess that's permitted now.
I have 4 children, and I've worked so hard to cultivate their lives and their beingness. And so the idea that they can have a random encounter with a police officer and they get to end their life, they get to end their future.
My plans were to actually be a police officer, but then I realized that that one good apple and a bad badge really doesn't make a difference, because once you sign your life over to that badge, you have to be loyal to who you work for.
My hope for the future is that the injustices that continue to happen over and over again, that they can be learned from and used as a lesson in order to create change.
For a closer look at these concerns and fears, I'm joined by Tracy Kazee, co-founder of the Center for Policing and Equity. She is also a former Denver police captain and a former NYPD Deputy Commissioner of Equity and Inclusion. And Tef Poe, he's an activist and rapper who started Hands Up United in reaction to the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. The group advocates for more accountability in policing. Thanks so much to both of you for being here. I'm going to start with you, Tef. What was your reaction to seeing the death of George Floyd?
I felt very disturbed that a law enforcement officer could murder somebody like that in cold blood. And I was even more disturbed by the fact that the other officers stood around and watched it. And I think that speaks a lot about the state of our country today.
Tracy, what did you think when you saw that white police officer kneeling on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds?
For me, it's not just why. Why are you doing that? It is one of which, why is everybody standing around and why isn't anybody intervening? I think like most, I was physically almost sick to my stomach. Again, conflicted. I've been in uniform. I've certainly been in spaces where, I've had to use force. But just the immediate reaction to me is why again? Why are we here?
Tef, talk to me a little bit about your experience as a Black man and your interactions with policing.
I try to keep my interactions with law enforcement as minimalistic as possible. It can go any type of way in those discourses, and it usually doesn't go in my favor. Even if I'm calling the police on someone that could be attacking me or breaking into my home, it could still result in me ending up the person that's dead. So my first memory of the police in a real sense as a young Black boy is my father pulling into a driveway to back out because we had drove into a neighborhood and got lost. And the police pulled into the driveway and pulled us over. Pulled him out the car, questioned him, threatened to take him to jail because they said that they knew we didn't live at that house. And I just remember that. And that left a lasting impression to me about interacting with the police almost for the rest of my life, even to being a young adult myself who's had pistols aimed at me by the police, shot at by the police.
Tracy, what do you make of what Tef is saying? Where have you seen bias play out in policing, and what reforms do you think need to take place?
So, Tef doesn't need me to validate his voice. I think he said it perfectly. That is the experience of many Black men in America that he so aptly described. And when we talk about where do we see bias, you see bias in all areas, but I think what you have to do is back up and understand the system of criminal justice itself was designed to do exactly what it's designed to do. And so when we talk about structural racism, we talk about how it plays out and what it looks like, we know there's disparities in the outcomes of policing. And what's happening here today is not a reform movement. This is a movement that's going to require something absolutely different than what is happening. And unless there's a coordinated effort to look at what we are calling policing today, and if we're not taking into account about how communities believe their public safety should be served and delivered, or even if not, we can talk about reforms all we want. And I don't know about Tef, but for me, there's exhaustion. There's generational exhaustion here. And it's just not going to be, nor will it be allowed to be, the same.
Tef, I met you in Ferguson in 2014. You were active in the protests then after the killing of Michael Brown. Why do you think this moment in 2020 is different and is happening? And what do you make of that exhaustion that Tracy's talking about?
Tracy couldn't be more correct. Donald Trump is a master of outrage fatigue. Every week, every day, every hour, every millisecond of the functioning day, there's something to be outraged about. And we have to remember that the Obama administration did not challenge the militarization of policing to the degree that we have reworked our memories to remember. And we also have to remember that we are now functioning in this linear aspect of a two-party system where neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are giving us suitable answers about what to do about rogue policing. As things currently stand, this isn't really a black or white thing anymore. So that's the real problem for the United States government at this point, that the citizens are genuinely uprising on their own and taking matters into their own hands.
The Minneapolis Police Department was credited in some ways as trying to implement some of the changes and reforms that activists were calling for, but this still happened. Tracy, can you talk a little bit about the barriers to change here?
So one of the things is, the culture of policing itself. This is not new. This is not a conversation that is just popping up on the radar. There's been long conversations about the culture of policing and the narratives that support some of the things that happen. The other thing, too, is you have chiefs that don't last, right? So if you have someone who's trying to do the right thing, chiefs' tenures are usually 3 to 4 years. That's not enough to do much of anything, but to maybe do policies and train folks. The other barriers is that you really need to think about what's happening here are not just officers who are engaging. You have to fundamentally think about what type of police or officer do you want? What do you want in them? What should they be able to demonstrate and do? One of the sort of fixes to this were to have officers of color, Black officers in organizations. And if you have not, take the time and speak to officers of color and women, and they will definitely tell you that when you're in a male-dominant profession or a white male-dominant profession, there are hurdles. And typically, folks who want to do the right thing meet barriers. People who speak out against the right thing meet barriers. And then you have the organization itself, which is typically still predominantly white male. There's some exceptions to that. But you also have to think about what you have going on inside when you look at organizations where decisions are being made, where all of the patrol officers are down at the bottom, of color are at the bottom. And as you look up through the organization, through people who have an direct impact on policy and community, it is not reflective. Part of moving forward will be you have to address those things. And there's been plenty of recommendations, plenty of evidence-based pieces that have been given that can help do that.
What do you say to people who think all police are just bad? Why do you still believe in this system of policing?
So first, let me talk about all police are bad. I mean, I understand where that would come from. I get it. But because I work with them personally, I was one, I know that's not the case. I know there's people inside that organization, many organizations, trying to do the right thing. The question that's left on the table is, what does that look like moving forward? And so we do know that going back to the old rule book of how you engage and how do you inform your policies are not going to work.
Last word to you, Tef. Where do we go from here? What do you want to see happen?
What I would love to see happen is for both Black and white police officers to really open up their third eye and understand what's happening here. You are allowing yourselves to be weaponized to the good of the oligarchs, to the good of people who have no good for you. In a sense, you have become the toy soldiers of the rich. And that can change right now, but we as the citizens can't change that. And there's no way in hell that law enforcement should be at war with the constituencies that they live next door to right now. Like when you take that uniform off, you live next door to the same people you're shooting at. And that's ridiculous.
So much to talk about. Thank you, Tracy and Tef.
As we discussed earlier tonight, this past week's protests have also reignited demands about tackling deep inequality in America. African Americans face staggering gaps in wealth and income, in education, housing, and health care, gaps that have been laid bare and made worse by the coronavirus pandemic. Even as today's jobs report for the month of May saw white unemployment drop, Black unemployment rose to nearly 17%. Amna Nawaz will focus on the roots of these problems in a moment. But first, let's hear from people who live with them.
To be Black in America is to know the full preciousness and the full precarity of life. I have asthma, and since the lockdown has sort of happened around the pandemic, I haven't left my home. I'm telling you this so that you understand how much it would take to get me out of the house and to be on the streets, that the risk was worth it to me.
The protests have a lot of white allies, and I love that. Now, what I would like to see is to have those people using the power of their purse to help Black businesses grow, because we desperately need it, especially in the era of COVID-19.
Slavery built every piece of this country. There is not one sector, not one industry that this slavery did not help. The banking, education, health, pick anything, right? We built this. Of course we believe in this. Of course we believe in this country.
It starts with our school system, writing Black people and people of color into the curriculums, because racism is something that is learned.
Racism isn't just a racist cop shooting someone or choking them out, that it's also how we show up in our workplaces. It's how we assess healthcare access and equality, how we assess education and employment as well, that all of these areas have work to do.
The consistent theme across oppression is that Black people are at the core of it. If we're talking about misogyny and the gender wage gap, it's Black women who are being most impacted. If we're talking about reproductive justice, if you're a Black woman in this country, regardless of class, you are 243% more likely to die from maternal morbidity or mortality.
I gave birth to my first son at Piedmont Hospital in Atlanta. You would express your pain, or you would express a particular issue that you're having. And the number of times that medical professionals would say to you, oh, let's just wait it out and see if it doesn't get better. I live in my body. I live in my experience. So I already know that it's going to be minimized. So I do everything possible on my end. So by the time I come to you, I am in desperate need.
When this all calms down, what happens? What's the new normal, right? Right now, yeah, this is good, right? This is positive. But what happens when there's no signs and there's no cameras, there's no microphones? What are we doing every day, each and every day?
For more now on how those inequalities are perpetuated, even protected by American systems and institutions, I'm joined by Dr. Lauren Powell, Executive Director of Healthcare at Time's Up, which fights harassment and discrimination. She was previously the Director of Health Equity for the Virginia Health Department. William Darity is a professor of public policy at Duke University and the co-author of the book From Here to Equality: Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. And Nikole Hannah-Jones. She's an investigative reporter for the New York Times Magazine, and she led their Pulitzer Prize-winning 1619 project, examining the legacy of slavery in this country and centering the stories of Black Americans. Welcome to you all, and thank you for being here. And Dr. Powell, I want to start with you because we cannot forget this moment is unfolding on top of a global health crisis here in America. Black Americans are disproportionately affected. They make up 13% of the population, but more than a fifth of all COVID-related deaths. You've called this your nightmare scenario. Why?
Well, I think that this moment is a confluence of several
historic injustices all in once. I was talking with a colleague not too long ago, and a colleague in emergency management, and I really expressed that my biggest fear was that something as terrible as the murder of George Floyd would happen in the middle of this pandemic, and that people would feel the need and the rightful need to protest in this moment. And the intersections of what COVID-19 is already doing to the Black community, on top of the potential for spread in protests, certainly led to what I called my worst nightmare, and what is actually coming to pass right now.
Professor Darity, I want to ask you about the economic crisis we also cannot ignore, which is yet again disproportionately affecting Black Americans. Black workers have been disproportionately affected. Their businesses, many of them are essential workers, continuing to work on the front lines. It cannot get any clearer that the fact that the gaps in wealth and wages predate the pandemic, though, in this one graphic, and I just want to share this. It was published this week in the Washington Post. It shows median household wealth over the last 70 years in America. That top line, which is continuing to go up, is white household wealth. The bottom line is Black household wealth, basically stagnant over 70 years. People will look at that and wonder, how is that possible? What do you say to them?
I think it's a consequence of the intergenerational effects of the cumulative impact of America's racial history. The starting point for that gap that you've described in the image that you presented is the failure to provide the formerly enslaved with the 40-acre land grants that they were promised at the end of the Civil War. That failure was accompanied by the provision of 160-acre land grants in the western part of the United States to numerous white families. So on the one hand, the formerly enslaved got nothing, which precluded their opportunity to pass resources down to subsequent generations, while many white Americans received substantial land grants. And then American national policies surrounding housing acquisition in the 20th century, particularly redlining, as well as the presence of predatory lending for home ownership. All of these factors accumulate over time to create the kind of racial wealth disparities that we're observing now.
And Nicole, to bring us back to this moment now, we're having a question when we look at the wealth of individuals and households, but also how we as a country spend our resources. It's led to this question and the message of defunding the police. I'm curious what you make of that conversation right now.
Well, what we know is in a capitalist country, what we value is shown by what we put our resources towards. We have seemed to have an unending amount of resources towards police, towards militarizing the police, towards building jails, towards incarceration, even as we've seen public school spending go flat, even as we have seen decline in spending on public goods and services, even as we've tried to cut programs, social safety net programs, such as food stamps. So what the pandemic has shown us is that if we decide that we want to meet basic needs of our citizens, we in fact can do that. We just are choosing not to. We suddenly have found that we can provide all of our students with internet-ready devices if we want to, that we can ask cable companies to give free internet to our students, that we can provide 3 meals a day for families in our schools. Many of these things that we said we couldn't do, we've done. How do we then go back to not doing those things once this pandemic is over?
You mentioned the education component, which doesn't get enough attention, and you've done so much extraordinary reporting unpacking the ongoing segregation of American schools. We talk a lot about official accountability in this time, but I want to ask you about individual accountability. Can you explain a little bit about how the individual decisions that we make as Americans, about where we live and where we send our kids to school, how that contributes to that segregation?
Yes, of course. So we know that inequality is both structural and held up by individual choices that everyday Americans make. We have school districts that are very segregated, but they're segregated because the most powerful parents in a school district, which are affluent white parents, want it that way. And so on the one hand, we have large numbers of Americans, a majority of Americans, who say they believe in school equality and they believe in integration. But then they make individual choices that benefit their own children, that ensure that their own children will get access to the best public schools. They fight against efforts to take off things that screen children out, like exams to get into schools, portfolio reviews to get into schools. And so even though we see these large kind of systemic inequalities, parents are holding those inequalities up with their individual choices and also fighting the systemic changes as well.
Professor Darity, let me follow up with you on that. This idea of individual accountability when it comes to the economy, when it comes to systems that have been built over 400 years, how do individuals start to make decisions to dismantle them and to make sure that those racist ideas are not perpetuated?
So I think individuals have to get into the process of supporting social policies that could make the structural changes in American life that could alter the kinds of inequalities that we're talking about. It's also a question of what your political actions are in terms of supporting the kinds of social policies that we need to alter the circumstances. And in particular, with respect to the racial wealth gap, in the work that I've done with Kirsten Mullen and the book that you mentioned, From Here to Equality, we've argued that a program of reparations would be required to eliminate that huge racial wealth chasm. And a program of reparations on the order of the provision of $10 to $12 trillion in resources to Native Black Americans. These resources would be required because we're in a present situation in which Black Americans constitute about 13% of the nation's population, but only have 2.6% of the nation's wealth. Black heads of households with a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of white heads of households who never finished high school. And this is clear evidence of the effects of the long-term cumulative effects of America's racial history that I mentioned earlier.
Dr. Powell, there is this cumulative effect clearly. We're having this conversation right now largely because of policing and because of the life and death nature of policing for Black Americans. The decision just to go out and protest right now is a life or death decision. When you look at all of the protests that are growing, are now unfolding in every single state, what's your biggest concern? How do you tell someone whether or not they should participate in this moment?
I do think we have to recognize there are some risks in going out to protest right now, right? We are still in a public health emergency. We are still in a pandemic. And so to that extent, protesters should absolutely be protecting themselves. This entire situation has unfolded around police and the excessive use of force. That means they should really be rethinking, should you be using pepper spray? Likely not in a pandemic where the virus is spread through person-to-person transmission, through droplets. Pepper spray causes people to cough. Tear gas causes people to cry and causes people to want to remove their masks. And so these are some of the things that our own government and our own lawmakers should be considering even in this moment. And I will say, I think it's a privilege to be able to think about separating the two of these moments together. The underlying golden thread, if you will, between COVID-19 and the response we're seeing following the murder of George Floyd, the golden thread that binds the two together is racism. And so there will never be a convenient moment. There will never be a convenient time to begin the work of dismantling racism. And so to that point, I think that people have to weigh the odds on their own. They have to weigh the risks on their own, and do recognize that we are still in an emergency. And so there are still risks to going out, but I do think that it's possible to do it safely.
I thank all three of you very, very much for your time and for being with us. That's Dr. Lauren Powell, Nikole Hannah-Jones, and Professor William Darity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The past 2 weeks have been a wake-up call to many. But for Black Americans, racism, bias, and offensive behavior are blended into their lives, in their workplaces, in their communities. And as many of them told us, it weighs on both them and their children.
When I was 9 years old, my father took away my water gun. He said, "You can't have a water gun because the police won't know that you're a little boy."
I've spent the last week paying close attention to the developments out of Minneapolis and globally. I've taken my 1-year-old son to the White House multiple times so that he could, feel it, if not understand it. A lot of children get to play offense in life. You get to take risks. You get to overcome failure. You get to learn lessons the hard way. And I think Black kids have to play defense first.
This fear is real for us. It's not an illusion. We've been dealing with this all of our lives.
You have to tone yourself down as a Black person just so white people can't be afraid of you.
I don't want to tense up every time I see a police car and automatically my hands go to the top of my steering wheel. I want us to thrive, not just try to survive each day, try to survive each encounter.
I come from a multiracial family. I have always felt like, and my parents, in direct and indirect ways told me all throughout my childhood and even in my adult years that I have to work twice as hard to prove myself, and it's not fair. That I can't make mistakes like other people make mistakes, because I will be judged differently. I will experience consequences differently.
People of color are always being told we have to be the ones to forgive. I want to know why. Why do I have to forgive you when you continue to hurt me? Why do I have to forgive you when you continue to hurt those I love? Why do I have to forgive you when you continue to make the kids I work with feel less than? I shouldn't have to forgive you for that.
For African American families, the challenges, the pain, and the outright exhaustion connected with this kind of behavior present their own distinct burdens. Special correspondent Charlene Hunter-Gault talks with a father and his grown son about their work over decades to create change.
Cleveland Sellers, a.k.a. Cleve, is one of the iconic legends of the 1960s civil rights movement. His son, Bakari Sellers, is a former South Carolina legislator whose recent book is called My Vanishing Country.
Thank you so much for joining me. It's great to see you after all these years. Let me start with you, Cleve. Based on your years of experience, this George Floyd killing is nothing new, right?
Absolutely. The murder of Emmett Till was the thing that I developed my social consciousness around.
And of course, Emmett Till was lynched ostensibly from whistling at a white woman. And so how did all of what you were experiencing during the civil rights movement, right on up through the time you yourself got shot in Orangeburg while young people were demonstrating and 4 men were killed, how did that affect your advice to your son, Bakari, growing up?
African-American men had to tell our sons about the survival skills, and we all had to tell them the protocol that they should follow in order for them not to get arrested for just being indignant about the name calling by police officers and antagonisms by police officers, so that they could get home and we could then litigate or protest the actions of that particular officer. So it became important for me to do that with all 3 of my children, one who was a daughter. And we talked to her about driving at night in the blue light on and having to pull over in an area that had lights and had some people around so that you wouldn't be isolated and then end up like Sandra Bland.
So Bakari, how did your father's advice impact you?
Well, it wasn't as much the advice as it was the examples that my father set. And I'm a product of the proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. In my book, My Vanishing Country, I talk about all of these people who were part of my proverbial village. And my father always took me to the memorials. He always took me to the services. He let me have these, sit at the adult tables and have these conversations with many of these heroes. And I write, and because it's so true, that heroes walk among us. And so many of the lessons that were passed down to me, they were built on the premise that our history is more than just Martin, Malcolm, and Rosa, but instead we have to uphold the names like Ella Baker, like Fannie Lou Hamer, like Majeska Simpkins and Septima Clark. And those lessons are the ones that ring true, especially today.
And you pass those along to your children as well?
I have a 15-year-old daughter who just got her permit, and now she'll be driving. And many of those conversations that Black parents have to have with Black children, the conversations that white people don't have to have with their kids, we're now having today. You know, I talked to my daughter about the same things my father just said. If a police officer is behind you, make sure you call 911 and go to a well-lit area, because I don't want her to be Sandra Bland. I don't want her to be mistaken for anything, so she has to watch her hands. I mean, at the end of the day, one of the things we need to realize is that in this country, many Black folk don't get the benefit of their humanity. And I'm petrified that one day there may be an officer who does not see my daughter as being anything as being anything but human. You know, in the George Floyd case, you can't tell me that those officers saw George as being a human being. They stepped on his neck for 8 minutes. And that's the fear that I have of raising a Black child, that her life will be cut short simply because of a fear, a paranoia, a lack of humanity, or a lack of dignity because she's a Black girl in this country.
Let me ask both of you, given the reaction, widespread reaction to the George Floyd case, are you optimistic that things are finally going to change? I mean, I just heard you give a long list of things that have been going on with Black children all these years.
I think that, you know, for the Black Lives Matter, it's time to begin to bring people together and to organize folk and begin to put something in place that has some kind of texture to it and some kind of framework to it.
And Bakari, how optimistic are you that this new wave of protests are going to change things in a very significant way, perhaps more than in the past?
Well, I don't know if I can say that, but the biggest problem is that this has become a cycle that's perpetuated in this country. And let me also just push back slightly on the framing of the question, because I don't want anybody to believe that this is about George Floyd alone. This isn't. This is about George Floyd. This is about Breonna Taylor. This is about Ahmaud Arbery. This is about David McAtee. And this is about systemic injustice and institutionalized racism that's been perpetuated in this country for years upon decades upon centuries. And to channel my father and Fannie Lou Hamer, people are sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so now we're at the point now where my job is to break that perpetual cycle. And I'm proud that people like Taylor Swift and Carson Wentz and Trevor Lawrence are coming out.
So you sound a little bit optimistic that this massive protest movement from around the world, not just in this country, but around the world now, that's a big change from the past, isn't it?
I don't know if it's a big change. Let me just say that my father's generation captivated the world before. Like, I don't really give people credit for showing up. I want to see the follow through, and I hope that people are there, and I have faith that people will be there, but this will be new. This will have to be a new door that is opened. And, you know, I have 3 children, and I'm going to remain on this journey for truth and justice and peace. But I don't want to pass them down the same America that I have now. Just very quickly to both of you as a final question, how much of the follow through is going to depend on voting?
Well, I think a lot of it is going to depend on voting, but there are going to be structural changes that are going to have to occur. And I think it was Roy Wilkins said, how many coffins must we walk behind before we can find justice and equality and peace and love?
So I think I hear both of you saying what you used to say, we all used to say back in the day of the civil rights movement, we've got to keep on keeping on. Is that right, Bakari?
Keep on keeping on. No justice, no peace.
Thank you.
And thank you, Charlene. As we've heard throughout the program, there's a responsibility to move to meaningful and lasting change that all of us, especially white Americans, have to address. Many people have been asking for resources and ideas. On our website, you can find a list of books, articles, podcasts, and videos aimed at helping all of us challenge our own biases and educating ourselves about institutional racism and the barriers that African Americans still face every day. You can find all that at pbs.org/newshour. And that concludes our special, Race Matters, America in Crisis. We want to thank all those who shared their voices tonight, and we want to thank you for taking the time to listen along with us. Our country has been rocked in the aftermath of one event in one city. But to heal and move forward as a nation, it will take many difficult conversations in every city and town with as many of us engaged as possible. At the start of the pandemic, we came together as a country, and by staying at home, that unity helped save lives. Now, we have the chance to come together again, to change lives and save them too. I'm Judy Woodruff. For all of us at the PBS NewsHour, thank you. Please stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.